Thank you for being here. I was just telling some people like a few minutes ago that my DPC before this one was like 8 years ago, a very long time. So I'm very happy to be back. And you probably don't remember me, or if we met before, it wasn't in these circumstances. I'm Georgiana, and I'm coming from Romania for now. I've been living in Amsterdam like 8-9 years ago. So in the meantime, I got a kid and I continued doing PHP. I'm actually working with PHP for like 15 or 16 years. It's a very long time, and I've been hacking all sorts of things with it. Lately, I've been working mostly on enterprise applications, so the kind of applications that you pass through the platform tens of millions of dollars a day. Unfortunately, dollars, not euros, but that might change in the future for me. So I coin myself as a large-scale application consultant, but basically I do anything with pleasure. So I'm a big hacker and a big supporter of moving things forward and not doing the same things over and over and over again. Last year I did something really crazy because I got into the speaking world. So I started Romania PHP. We don't have a national conference, didn't have until last year. And because I never organized even my own wedding, it was such a difficult thing to do. And we're going to make another one 2 weeks from now. So because it's such short notice, maybe you want to travel to Romania next year for our 3rd edition and see what interesting things we do there. So because I only do crazy things lately, for some reason I started a PhD in systems engineering. But the topic is kind of bridging the systems engineering part with machine learning and AI. So this was like the thing that sparkled my interest towards changing a chatbot that we already had. And what I want to start my talk with is like an example of what we did like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when our project managers were doing things the manual way, coming over and asking the testers, do you know what's going to be in the next release? Have you tested things and so on? And then the testing people would go to developers to ask for information, what have you guys finished? And developers are, if they're updating Jira, they will just say, just go in there in the task tracking system and find out what you can test. But then the testers would actually need to go to a system engineering team at the time. We call it today DevOps, but DevOps is so much more than that, to ask for another build with those changes that the developers did, and then actually start testing. And the build part is kind of complex. So at the time when we had our first DevOps chatbot, we were using Puppet for configuration management and worked with RPMs for Red Hat 6, which is not the nicest place to be in, but we still did it. And then after creating those RPMs based from many branches that the developers had ready for testing, we would install that, and then the QA team, you see, I don't have enough space to go on the slide, but then when something broke, we would, something wouldn't pass QA, we would have to repeat this manual process over and over and over again. So in 2012, when we were working for this large American customer with Red Hat 6 constraints, what we did was discover a plugin for Skype. It's not technically a plugin, it's like more of a script that you could hook into Skype, and then it would be very similar to what you know today as Slack chatbots. Like you configure a certain command, and then the bot will respond to that command. And the first command that we implemented was the discover one, because we had so many environments. So we, in theory, we had development, and then we had QAT, and then we had integration. All of these are complete full stack environments for the application. And then we had staging, which we didn't control at all. and then we had production, which we didn't even dream about touching, right? So in these 5 different environments, cloud-based, we would have like gazillions of servers. So you couldn't possibly humanly remember all the names and SSH into a server and do anything. So the first command that we had was like the discover all the environments and find out all the machine names for these environments. And then we would have like another command saying, can you provision this crazy environment? And if you look here, this is from staging, right? And it's like the second machine, so you would need to do that on every machine. Quite complicated, but you could do it from Skype. So it was pretty awesome because the testers would actually be able to do it for QAT and prepare the build themselves and put the code there, right? And then in order to actually install that build, you would also have the command that that the bot was listening for, and then we said install on this particular machine this package with this version. But you still need to manually go and figure out what version of the RPM you needed to install because nobody told you, and we didn't have time to cook the chatbot anymore. But this was already pretty cool, right? Yeah, so today what I will show you is like a very modern version of that, but it's something that you can take home and use. So I have some code samples for you. It's a Dockerized version, so my Docker is not perfect, so if you see something bad in there, please don't be mad at me. It's not the most pixel perfect configuration that you would find, but it has all the components. So it has a Dockerized version of Jira, it has a Dockerized version of Jenkins, so you don't need to connect to any other service, you just use this one to play with. And then we have the interesting parts, coding parts that we will talk about in more detail later. Okay. And to do the Jira setup, because when you install it, most of the time as a developer, I never installed Jira, so I had no idea how to do it. So it took me like 2 or 3 attempts to do it. So now you have a video recording my process. Maybe it will help you. So the agenda for this talk is like a slight introduction to chatbots. Let's see how we actually came to use chatbots in 2018, and then I will try to show you like let's say the architecture of Johnny the Deployer, which is the modern version of what you've seen previously, and we'll look at some demos based on the code sample that you have. So the code sample is a very stripped down version. It's of course doing a lot less than what we do with our production bot, but it's something that I repeat, you take home and play with and hack it too, right? So chatbot, who here wrote a chatbot so far? Quite a few people. What front-end technology did you connect it to? And when I say front-end, I maybe mean Slack or something else. Were they Slack chatbots? Yeah. Did you connect it to anything else? Facebook, okay, right? So let's see how this thing started. So the first chatbot is like very old. It's like 1966. And it comes from the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And it did pattern matching. So because we are a PHP audience, right? Regexp is our best friend. So this is kind of similar to what Eliza did back in the day. So let's say a lot of time passed, and they actually started to play from that first point. And then we have ActDrop, which is something that's built for IRC. Do you know what IRC is? Are you old enough to know what IRC is? Yeah. So some administrators of IRC had trouble manually clicking or not things. So they wrote a collection of TCL scripts and C code to perform the management. So that's why this is like a more programming-oriented chatbot, right? The catch is the first one, Eliza, people thought it was not a pattern matching bot, but they gave it personality. So this is the difference between interacting with a chatbot-like interface and with a form-based interface, because you can trick people into believing there's some human at the very end of the line. And I will finish the history page. I don't like history, but my husband is a historian, so I tend to have like a history slide all the time. So the first real production level chatbot comes from 2001, and it's called Smarter Child. Have you heard of it? No. Well, the catch is it was destined to work on AOL. So because AOL is such a popular platform, of course you didn't hear about it, but it's like the first modern version of a chatbot in terms of what it can do and how you can interact with it. And if you are starting to get serious about chatbots, I strongly recommend you having a look first at bot directories, because you will find out about what other people are doing with chatbots, first of all. And there are a lot of lists, but these are like the ones that I use most, I tend to use most. And this one, the last one, even if it's not the most popular and has like horrible user interface, you see, it has some interesting information. Of course, it doesn't have an extensive list of all the chatbots, but what I use it for is to see how many, let's say, front-end parts we would need to connect to if a customer came to us and asked for a chatbot. And if they would come and say, I need to do something for Windows Mobile, for Gadu or something else, at least I need to know that there are others in the field, right? So that I can look for what to do in the front-end bit of the bot. So if we start thinking more practically, how do we implement a chatbot, right? What is it? In technical terms, well, it's just a person interacting with a conversational-like interface, and it can be anything. So if it's like a Slack chatbot, it's just a text-based thing, right? But this year, I think now I'm working on my 5th chatbot interface, and everybody wants it differently. So some of them are website plugins that you can attach to the website or not. Others are button-based, so you just select some of the options. The other customers just say, give me an interface where I can where the customer can type in text, and you have to figure out what's going on. So it's like a lot of options for this conversational interface just to begin with. But this is very important because this is what your customers interact with, and they believe this is the bot, right? When in fact the bot is the conversation interface plus a very large chunk of code doing the actual backend processing for the bot, and maybe doing the intelligence part if we get as far. So in order to address all of those different communication channels, and I just selected like 2 to put on a slide, but you've seen there are so many of them. There is such a thing called bot frameworks. So that the message that you get from Slack and the message that you get from Twitter or from Facebook, every single one of these endpoints has like a different method of sending you the data, which can be a nightmare if you want to have a bot that interfaces with all of these communication channels. So what the bot framework does is it normalizes all these formats into just one. And the ones that we chose to build like the modern version of Johnny the Deployer was BOTMASTer. There are a couple of others just as good, but this one was the one that we favorite for certain business reasons, to say. And then what happens is that you always get the data, the message from any communication channel in the same format. So then you just parse one type of data and move it forward to the processing part. And I picked up some code from the BOTMASTer documentation to help you see that in the end you create a new BOTMASTer instance, but you can interface with a lot of things. So when you see here Messenger bot, it refers to Facebook Messenger in particular. And a very good thing is that you can have Socket.io bot. So what this allows you to do is to grab input from various sources, but also push it to like an internal dashboard page, for example. So you get people sending you requests in, but you can have those requests or some other things pushed to a Socket.io endpoint. And then with all those configurations that you add to the instances of the endpoints that you want to connect to, you just say this BOTMASTer instance, you add the new Twitter bot or Telegram bot or whatever, and then this is the magic that happens to translate all those messages into just one format. It's quite a simple thing to achieve. Actually, I gave this task to one of my summer interns last summer, and it took him 2 days after reading the documentation to get this working. So I'm sure in your case it will be much less. So that is one of the reasons we selected BOTMASTer, because it had a very friendly documentation and checked all the communication channels that we needed. So I will refer further to the BOTMASTer as the bot, because the customer interacts with that. But the actual processing part for me is the brains, the part that actually does the job. So if we want to add understanding, so instead of just giving, you saw the first commands that we used in Skype, they were like snap and then some parameters in a certain order, which is complete crap if you ask a project manager to do it. Do a deployment and remember these parameters in this order, and they will go like, no, thank you. So if we want to add understanding, our scenario was to use Watson, which is a cloud-based NLP. And you can choose any other competition. There's Dialogflow, for example. Everybody has one. So Microsoft has Louis, and Dialogflow comes from Google. This is IBM. If you, for example, I had one customer this year who said it is absolutely impossible that the data that people enter in the chatbot leaves my company. You cannot do that. So we had to find like an on-premises solution for the NLU part. And there is a German company, it's a startup, I think they're based in Berlin, but I'm not really sure, I never checked. It's called RASA, so R-A-S-A, and they have an NLU part that you can control, or you can use the core, and you all of a sudden have a platform for doing this. So it's not mandatory for the data to leave your company, just like in our client's case, because when you enter their headquarters, you have like 3 security filters, and they stick all sorts of tapes so that you don't make pictures or you don't record anything. So you might happen to be in one of these situations. So then there are options for you. But there is a word of warning here. The cloud-based platforms are much faster to train and a bit more accurate, because they are not only using the data that you send for training yourself, they are also using other people's data. So it's like this. But it's faster to train the model, so it's a matter of minutes. If you use Rasa, it can take a few hours depending on the number of scenarios that you have to parse. So then you have to get creative with Amazon costs, but that's like a different story. So when we say IBM Watson, don't think about detective stories, because this is not the case. So actually they gave the name after the first IBM CEO, and Watson is not just one technology. So we will use later Watson Conversation, which is like the first step into doing chatbots, but a very thing that you can do with it, they rename the technologies all the time, so this is one downside. When I started, it was called Dialogue, and after a few months they renamed it to Conversation, and who knows what the name will be 1 year from now. So just be aware that some documentation links are broken. It does have a free tier, so you can definitely play with it. And the paying part is not that much. So if you just work with the simple text messages, short, then money won't be a problem for a chatbot. The good part about starting using the Watson umbrella is that you can later move to a more powerful version of NLU, which is called Knowledge Studio, where you can input large blobs of text, and you can start annotating them so that the Watson endpoint will in fact understand your specific business needs and language and not use everybody else's. So you can grab like what we did. We grabbed, for example, requirements documents, put them in there, and then we discovered the domain knowledge. So it was like doing domain-driven design in a Word-like editor and doing annotations. Very cool. And then it will really understand what your users are talking about, not somebody else's users. Right? So this is the level 2, 3 part. So if we are to start a little bit with Watson, it's quite simple. It's organized into workspaces. And it already comes with a very nice collection of examples in the car dashboard sample. So you can start investigating what they did with the car dashboard, play with that one, and read a bit of the documentation, and then you can work on your own. So in here, if you just look at the details, you will see that it has like a unique identifier, and that's something that you will need to use later on in the configuration settings. So if you look here, I like this interface from Watson better than the Google one. It's more organized, or at least I'm used to it. But they all use the same concepts. So the first concept is intent, another one is entity, and finally the dialogue is how you structure the dialogue into steps that are made of intents. So if you recognize this intent, and then what is the next intent, and so on. So when you talk about intents in the car dashboard example, you can see that in here, to find out what the capabilities are, they are giving over 100 examples in order to train it to understand that you want it to tell you its capabilities. So the catch is this one with the decision replies, it only has like 10 training examples, and then it will have less accuracy than in the case of the capabilities, right? So the more information you want to give it to train, the more accurate your understanding part will be. So if we open up one of those, but for our chatbot, because it's faster, you see I only gave it like 6 examples, and this is what I'm working with. So I don't need like 100 samples because my language is very tight. So I only talk about issues, ready for testing, ready for QA, ready for QAT, right? So all sorts of sentences that I can make up. And then in the entity training, I will define synonyms. So I will say QAT is a synonym of QA and is a synonym of testing, right? So when you train it, then it will automatically recognize these environments. And the good part is for example, in here, some people don't refer canonically, right? Because it's like what people use in natural language. They say, what JIRAs do you have ready for QA, which is technically incorrect, right? You have tickets, issues, or whatever. But just because you train it like this, then it will start to understand that this is what you're talking about. And you have a try it out part where you can actually type in some text and you see if you configured it correctly. So if we say, what can we test? It picked up that this is what I want to ask, and it assigns the QA value to the environment variable, and then I will be able to get it back and use that information. So here I'm trying 2 examples that I didn't use in the training set, and still able to understand what's going on. Right? So if you play with this example and it will not recognize an intent, so you try some sentences. If it doesn't recognize the intent, then it will be very clear in this part. So then you have to give it more examples and so on. Quite easy. So let's move over a little bit to the architecture part of Johnny. It's a very fancy name for it. So it's mostly a state diagram to show you how the sequence of events is happening. So any of our teammates, be it the project manager or the tester or somebody else, is actually asking a question and is expecting an answer from the chatbot. And then the chatbot is just going to pass on the text and say, I have no idea what this person is talking about. Can you please figure out what they wanted to say? And this is the part where we hook into our NLU component. And we say, we send the text and we receive back the intent if it was identified correctly and the entities populated with values. And then we go in our case in Jenkins, and for example, if we say, when was the last time we deployed the API in staging, which is inquiry on historical data, we parse all the horrible JSON that is coming from the Jenkins API, and we give the nice answer to the person asking the question, right? So this is why the brace part is kind of the most important one, because it glues all the systems together and it does 99% of the error handling. So it's quite unusual to have the bot not communicate with the brains, but it's highly likely that the brains will not have access to the Jenkins box if it goes crazy or to whatever other endpoint. So this is the heavy lifting and this is PHP. So it looks skinny in the middle, but it's like this in terms of importance and code. So you can see here, like the previous diagrams, a bit reversed, that the PHP part actually interacts with all the systems. It does NLU, and after it does NLU, it can even do, we have one intent that triggers 2 parallel processes in Jenkins. So we go and say, execute these 2 Jenkins jobs at the same time. The order doesn't matter, they have to happen. Right? So you can do this because we have PHP in the middle. So of course, we at some point as a team moved from Skype to Slack. So the current version of Johnny is hooked into Slack, but it's not the simple type of bot that you can do with Slack. It's the more complex version. So what you need to do is go into the api.slack.com and get in your development workspace, create an application, right, a Slack application, and then you will receive two tokens. One of them is the OAuth, and the other one is bot user OAuth, because this will create a user in your chat. So permission management at this point is who is in the chat with this bot can execute those commands. You can do permission management at the very end in PHP and say this particular user has asked for production deployment. They shouldn't do it. They don't have the permission. You can pick this information up in PHP where you have access to the database and everything, and send an error to the bot if you wanted to. But this one is just showing you that we have a new user added to the Slack channel. And then everything that happens in Slack works with hooks. So in here, I just added my hook. It has to be verified for your bot to receive the information. And then you can subscribe to all sorts of events. So if you only want personal messages, right, in a direct message channel, you can only listen to those. If you only want to work in a group channel, then you can only enable that. It really depends on your setup. That's out of the scope for this talk to go into more details. And then the BOTMASTER, which is the JavaScript bot framework that we put right in front. The configuration is quite simple. We pick everything that we set in Slack. So you see this one is the one that can be connected to multiple endpoints. So the Slack configuration, it belongs to its own folder. And then you put the team identifier of the team that you want to add it to, and define the hook here, the one that we set up in Slack API previously. And then we just pick the client ID and the token from the environment variables, and quite a basic configuration. So let's see what happens when Slack is sending us a message like this. So there are two types of listeners that you can configure in BOTMASTER. One is incoming and one is outgoing. So you can hook into the process and say, I want to do magic with the output that is going to go to Slack. Or in this case, I want to listen to everything that's incoming and handle it myself. And if you see here, the first thing that we are doing is if there is a bot identifier defined, so it's not undefined, and or maybe it's our own Slack bot user ID, the one that Slack created for our application, then we are not going to pass it on to the brains, because then you will get into a never-ending loop of the bot listening to its own messages. So this is the first defense mechanism. And then what we do with the information that comes here in the update parameter, we pick the raw information, and this is what the user was typing in, which is the same if you go and do the Facebook client or the Twitter client. You just pick the text from there. The structure of the object will be the same. And then we, what we do is send this information to the brain endpoint, to the PHP part. And if the brain endpoint is not playing nice, so if it's not a 200 okay, we just say, I have a problem or something. We don't have it. So I never actually executed this part of the code, but it's good to play defensive. So if you want to make like a very short test to show it to you, we're just going to send a message to the PHP part with the text that the user has input, and then we get the information back. So this is like the structure of the PHP code that you will find in the code sample, just to help you get started. And you can see it's not very complicated. You have like 3 services. One of them is going to discuss with Watson and say, this is the question or whatever I got. Can you figure out what it does? The execute is the part that discusses with Jenkins and convinces Jenkins to do interesting things. And the task tracking part is connecting to Jira. So you have 3 services and the corresponding entities for each and every one of them. And just one controller. So we have just a couple of methods in there, nothing fancy. So what we do here, on the PHP level, we just grab the request, and my way of doing validation for such simple demo is to just deserialize the JSON that I receive into a request entity. And you see here I'm not throwing any errors because I have, in the Symfony code base, I have an exception listener. So if this is not going to be properly deserialized, I'm listening to the exception and doing the handling in the, somewhere here, in the listener part, right? So that code is hidden away from the controller, and then the controller is much more clean. So if for some reason we didn't receive any kind of message, we're not saying anything back, right? For a demo purpose, and then we just grab the endpoint, the service that would discuss to Watson, and ask the question. This is what the user said. Can you tell me what it's about? I have a logging information here because I will use it later on in the demo. And then in here you can already see that we grab the API response. And if there are no intent, then it means that Watson wasn't able to identify any intent in the user text. You might want to use a different error handling. As I said, this is just take-home code to hack, so your needs might be different from a demo purpose. But if we get intent, there may be multiple intents in something that the user said. So you want to look at each and every one of them and see what's the confidence level. You might want to have a threshold and handle them. So don't do this at home. Switch cases are not state-of-the-art programming, right? But this one fits in one slide. So if I did it in a more complicated way, it wouldn't fit in one slide and I couldn't explain it to you. So let's say you identified that somebody is asking what tickets are ready for QA is one example, but we can also ask what tickets are ready for production at the same time. So we just go and execute the ready for environment and pass in the environment variable that we identified. Or if we want to prepare a release candidate and do the deployment, also for the purposes of the demo, this is just one step. Normally, we have a couple of thresholds. So we do the build, we validate the build, and then we do the deploy, right? It takes a longer time, and this is something not so simple because it's a multi-stage process. But you will find the Jenkins, so in the sample code you already have the Jenkins endpoint configured for this second one, just for you to have a start. Or if you want to ask historical information, when was the last time a specific action happened in a specific environment for a component? So when was the last deploy to production of the API? Then we execute the third one. And also, I have a small PHP code example about connection to Watson. So based on the question string that we have, you will find all the entities needed to pass the information to Watson. So it's like the library. You see, we serialize it as a JSON and immediately send it to the service to pass on, and it will add all the proper headers and the tokens of the workspace, identifier, and so on that are in the configuration files. And then once we have the information back, also debugging purposes, this line, once we have the information back, we deserialize it in a proper object with our handling on the Symfony end with the listener. And then we can start looking into it. This is the object that we execute get intents on. And we only have 5 minutes left, so I will skip those 2 videos playing with the intents again, because what I want to do right now is to do the first demo. So if we do okay. So let me show you. The good thing about having Watson and other things is that you get for free the hi bye part, so the chit chat. It's very easy to configure. And then when we ask the question, you see here in the background the Jira opened, and there's nothing in this column. So the JQL that I'm executing is coming back empty. But now that I've moved that task and I want to ask the same question again, are there issues ready for testing? So it will come back with a list, and I made it clickable so that the project manager doesn't need to copy the text anymore like they did in the beginning, and they can see the task. And if we move something more in the column and ask another question, so all the examples that I'm typing in here are not in the examples that I gave Watson to train with. So this is the nice part. So that's why I have multiple examples. So now we should have both of them. Okay. So let's close it and show you. This is the second one. So if we do in here, I quit typing and I started doing copy pasting because it was taking less. So first thing, I'm deleting all the history in Slack just to start with a clean state for this demo. So the first thing we're going to say is I need you to build an RC. We call RC the release candidate for the CMS, which is one of the components that we have configured in Jenkins, and deploy it to QA. And because this is an asynchronous process and it can take a long time, we just send the information, okay, I got it, nothing wrong happened, and it's going to take a while. So in here, I have configured the Jenkins to randomly fail. So it does some crap things. So at some point it fails, some other times it doesn't. Maybe this is close to what will happen in your environment. So if we say here, build a new release candidate of the front end, this is sometimes slang for our team. So when they say front end, in fact, they mean the single page application code base. So you see here, the parameter was correctly identified from Watson and sent all the way over to Jenkins. And Jenkins comes back and tells us the status. So more fun with parameters, like in other environments, other things. Right, so quickly. I don't see my mouse. Because I want to have just a moment for questions in the end. So this last one is querying the Jenkins historical information for when was the website or the front end last deployed in staging. And I have here the command line debug messages. So you see here, once it's finished, you can click your way through to Jenkins. And what I'm showing you here is that the response JSON that we got from Watson, after selecting it properly maybe, So you see here that the moment it identifies an intent, it will also give you a confidence level. So when you have 0.92, it means it's 92% confident that it got what the user meant. And the next example, we have a lower value for the confidence. Let's see how it goes. So we ask, when was the CMS deployed to production? This is very different from our 10 sentences training set. So the confidence level will be lower. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's quite a tiny console. So you see here we have 54% confidence. So if you're somebody says something on the channel and you don't get enough confidence to execute the action, you can start either asking questions or not perform the execution, right? So this is why the confidence level is important, in addition to the fact that Watson can identify multiple intents with multiple confidence levels. So you only want to execute when, for your case, it makes sense. So we can go on and play with it for days, because it's so much fun. But what I am showing in the last example is the endpoint of Jenkins that I'm touching to get historical information. So we just delete that one. We execute this endpoint ourselves, go grab information from Jenkins. Today, John is using GitLab, so it's a completely different thing. We had to migrate to GitLab. But this way of talking to Jenkins via an API is very good. It's a lot of information. So that's why having a chatbot to filter this out instead of a human is so much better. So you can see here the parameters that we were asking in our question and came back from NLU, and the success state. So I think we should, yeah. So we went through a couple of demos, and now we have time for questions. Thank you. First question.
I use some NLPs, but does Watson have a decent language support?
So can you repeat the question, please?
Does the Watson NLP have a multi-language support? And if yes, are those as good as the English?
Okay, so the question is if Watson understands more languages, and if it does, is it as good as English? I've actually only been building chatbots for UK-based customers and one US-based customer. So I didn't fight this particular problem, but what I can tell you is that I did fight it for the very secure level chatbot. So we did it with Rasa NLU, so not with Watson. In particular, it's a different NLU technology. It's open source, by the way. So Rasa has a pipeline, and you can configure every individual step of the pipeline. So you can say, this is the German language, and this is the German dictionary that I want to use, and these are the tokenizers. So it's a very complicated technology to actually train a model, but you can configure every stage of the pipeline for a different language. I don't know if Watson does it. What you can do is use Knowledge Studio and train it with Dutch texts or German texts and use annotations, and then it will work in a different language. But conversation, Watson Conversation, which is the low-end version, I'm not really sure if it knows more languages. Should. Any other questions? Yes, I didn't see you.
Have you tried having this bot in like a chat room that other people speak with each other normally all the time, and like, would that work? Like, would it know if you ask it something, or?
Yeah, so if the question is if we used a chatbot for something different than technical understanding.
In like an open public room that the company, everybody speak with each other, but sometimes they maybe want to do something with the bot.
Yeah, so this is a very good question. So if everybody talks in one chat room, how will the bot pick up what's meant for him and not what everybody else is talking about? This is the part where you use the confidence levels. So if you want to put a bot in a very crowded chat room, which I don't recommend, because you will get a lot of HTTP traffic doing basically nothing. If everyone's from the company is in the same chat room, you might get permission issues, right? So you have to do a more complex coding in the backend. But if you do this, you just look at the confidence level of matching text. And if you don't have any matching intent at all, or the confidence level is above a certain threshold, you just don't execute that. But you can put a chatbot and listen to what everybody is talking, which is kind of the topic for my PhD. Thank you. Okay, we have that question first.
It's not really a question, just to add to that, you have the mention mechanism. So when you mention the bot, you can only respond to the direct mentions instead of listening everything to the room. So it's still safe to put it on a room with everybody, and unless you mention specifically the bot, then nothing else.
Yeah, so you are right that in the Slack permission mechanism, you can only listen to personal messages that are typed to you. Yeah, so you can do a lot of tricks. But if you're outside of Slack, how you do it? If you do a Twitter bot and everybody sends a lot of things to it because they want to play with it.
Do you still guard against human error saying the wrong thing?
Okay, so the question is, are people asking the wrong questions or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if they do it production deploy, they can still deploy the wrong thing, right?
Well, that is why I told you that in the demo we have build and deploy intent. Demo done, right? In reality, we don't have that. We have like 20 different intents. And we even have a mechanism where you sleep. So you effectively don't execute anything. And if the person did the mistake and wants to correct it, say, I said deploy to staging, no, and say stop it. So we have an intent to stop it and a reasonable amount of seconds for you to change your mind. If you come back after half an hour, I'm sorry, you know. But we had to build some of these things. Of course, this is not a product, so it's not on the market. So we kind of tell our users that they did the wrong thing or they're not using it correctly. But if this was a product that would grab money from its customers, then we'll have to fight a bit more with all the error handling mechanisms. Thank you very much.